Good afternoon. I'm Anna Musi, Interim Executive Director of the Driehaus Museum. Welcome to the opening panel discussion for our new exhibition, A Tale of Today, Nate Young and Mika Horibuchi. When we asked ourselves how a young museum housed in a Gilded Age mansion could offer a new way to connect past and present, we found the answer in the legacy of the Nickerson family through their intentions, passions, sentiments, and the art and design embedded in the walls of their 1883 home. The Nickersons opened their purpose-built art gallery to students of the Art Institute of Chicago for learning and growth. Emerging artists who were eager to explore worlds beyond their own found inspiration in the Nickersons' art collection that came from all over the world. These objects held stories of people and places not readily accessible. They became vessels for stories that could challenge or complete the viewer's perception of history and humanity. So 2 years ago, we inaugurated our new initiative, A Tale of Today, to bring contemporary views of the past inside the museum in order to add a fuller dimension to our presentation of both the glorious and the difficult narratives tethered to this era. The exhibition we open today is one component of this new initiative. Through contemporary art in dialogue with the design and legacy of the Nickerson Mansion, the past and present reside together and help us unlock historic and previously overlooked narratives through an experience that we believe will bring our community closer together. This exhibition is organized by the Richard H. Driehaus Museum and presented by Northern Trust with generous support and commitment from Jean and Eugene Stark, Gary Metzner and Scott Johnson, and the Richard H. Driehaus Exhibition Fund. We thank all of them, museum staff, Nate Young, Mika Horibuchi, and Kekeli Sumah, who brought this exhibition to life at an important moment in history. And finally, we are so grateful to our wonderful partners at EXPO Chicago for including A Tale of Today in their program lineup this weekend. I will now turn it over to Stephanie Cristello, Artistic Director of EXPO Chicago. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you for everyone who is watching at home. You don't have the privilege of being in this absolutely amazing building right now with this incredible exhibition, but as part of Exhibition Weekend, presented by EXPO Chicago with Hook and presenting sponsor Northern Trust, the Driehaus Museum has been one of our closest partners since launching this exhibition initiative, A Tale of Today. It is my distinct pleasure and privilege to be welcoming everyone here for this panel discussion. And I did want to thank also Anna Musi and the entire Driehaus staff for being such an amazing partner of EXPO Chicago's. Also on view here with Nate Young and Mika Horibuchi are their gallery support, and that is Patron Gallery from Chicago and Monique Meloche Gallery in Chicago, both of which are participating in Exhibition Weekend alongside 35 leading galleries and all of our partner institutions. While you can't view the exhibitions in a fair, you can make an appointment to view each of the exhibitions within their gallery spaces, as well as online through their platform. And we're really happy to have both Nate and Mika's work represented on the Exhibition Weekend platform. So without further ado, I did want to welcome all of the panelists here, colleagues and friends, and for what is sure to be an amazing discussion. And I'll be back at some point during the end of the conversation for moderating a Q&A. So if there are any questions that come up during the course of this panel, please feel free to put those in, and we'll make sure to get to them at the end of the discussion. So with that, thank you so much for everyone watching, and enjoy.
Hello, my name is Kekeli Sumah, and I am the 2020 Driehaus Museum Curatorial Fellow. And we're here to discuss The Tale of Today, Nate Young and Mika Horibuchi, and kind of think about how their works in this space brings together the ideas within the Gilded Age and brings them together with issues and conversations that are particular to the artist, but also particular to the issues and conversations that we're having today in the contemporary landscape. So to join me in this conversation, we have, of course, the artist, Mika Horibuchi, Nate Young. Mika Horibuchi is an artist interested in tricks and slips in visual perception. Horibuchi's work has been included in exhibitions at the MCA in Chicago, Patron Gallery, KMAC Museum in Louisville and at the Chicago Cultural Center. Horibuchi is represented by Patron Gallery here in Chicago. Nate Young is an artist working primarily in wood who draws on history, semiotics, and spirituality to explore the connections between collective and familial history, and between the material and the divine. Young's work has been included in exhibitions at the Suburban in Chicago, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the California African American Museum in LA, Room East in New York, and Monique Deloche in Chicago, where his work is represented. And on my left, we have our esteemed panelists, Anne Louis and Ross Jordan. Anne Louis is an architect and assistant professor of practice at the University of Michigan. She co-founded Future Firm, a Chicago-based architecture and design research office which designs spaces for people to come together in new ways. Anne Louis was also the co-curator of the U.S. Pavilion titled Dimensions of Citizenship at the 2018 Venice Architecture Biennale. Ross Jordan is a curator interested in the confluence of politics, history, and visual culture. As a curatorial manager at the Jane Addams Hall House Museum, Ross supports the production of exhibitions and programs that connect the social justice issues of the past to the present via collaborations with artists and community-based organizations. I wanted to open up the panel by first posing a question to the artist to talk through some of your ideas and the process by which you looked at the spaces in which your exhibitions were placed in and responded with the site-specific works that you made for the exhibition.
I'll go first. So for me, this was a super special, unique, rare invitation to be able to conceive and respond to the Drury House Museum, making work specifically to exist within this space, this historic house museum. And I wanted the exhibition, the works in the exhibition to be largely guided by the framework of the physical and historical framework of the Drury House Museum, while using Trompe l'oeil as a conceptual framework to open a dialogue about representation and what is represented, authorship and ownership, imitation, and archetype. I think in beginning to initially think about the exhibition, I began by researching first the history of the house and then the history of the museum as it exists now. And I think without trying to claim to represent or to analyze reality itself, I wanted to isolate certain features and then out of those features deliberately form a narrative that could feign a continuation of the history of the house and of the museum. In this space, this Gilded Age mansion that was built in search of a historical precedent to follow, I wanted to be able to continue, follow that lead and continue this history of mimicry.
Yeah, thank you. Nate, do you want to add to that?
Sure. I mean, for me, I was like, I had been working on this project for like maybe the last 2 years that had to do with the familial history. And I was, maybe thinking about what it means to access history. And in this case, in the case of the museum, there's a major restoration to try to bring something that has declined over history back to what it is in the present. And I think that there's a parallel between the way that I was thinking about accessing history in the way that the museum accesses a historical moment. I do a lot of woodworking, and I was really taken with the details and the ornateness of the space, and I wanted to make something that could stand in the room aesthetically, like hold its own aesthetic, presence in this space. So it was exciting to give myself the chance to sort of like challenge myself to do that. But conceptually, the work follows this trajectory of this project that I've been working on over the last 2.5 years, that has to do with the Great Migration and my great-grandfather's migration, and accessing those stories and kind of retelling them, not only retelling them to a public, but retelling them to myself, in order to think about the way in which we understand our own being in the world, our identity in the world, through materials, through language, through narrative. And maybe that there was something like potentially profoundly magical about that, as opposed to something that we understand as conventional in history. So, yeah, I mean, that's just a little bit about, that's what I was thinking about in the beginning when we first started talking about the show.
You've worked in historical spaces, Ross, and you often have to do kind of this retelling of history. Like when you're thinking about having seen Nate's work and how it's positioned in the space, and thinking about your own work, kind of what kind of connections or ties do you find, and what are some of the challenges that are present when thinking about how to bring a historic space to a contemporary audience?
Yeah, that's a perfect question. I mean, this is I think an ongoing challenge, and it's not something that is answered very easily. So I really appreciate Nate's kind of thinking about accessing history, because I think that's why the Whole House Museum also thinks about how it works and functions, is really giving people access to history and different narratives, and oftentimes trying to uncover history. And a lot of the work that Nate presents in this exhibition does just that, and only like within his own family, by kind of accessing, I guess, his own family archive, but also just via the presentation. Like I think they mentioned the material presentation, like the wood, and so that's in this space, but also that the kind of practice that Nate has is working with that material reality. And I feel like one of the ways that that we do that work at the museum is super similar, right? When we work with different artists, we're often trying to connect them to a legacy that they might not be aware of or might not know of, right? That's kind of embedded in some of the material realities of the whole art, like the museum I work at, the Whole House Museum, has lots of, has a collection full of textiles, has a ceramic collection. We have a bookbinding collection, and so we use that collection to kind of fuel the legacies and narratives that we want to inject into the space to help tell stories. So it's both like a material connection, I think, that really works strongly with artists, and there's that personal archive family history, which of course resonates with this space because this is a family home. I feel like that those kinds of ways of accessing history are really grounded, and I think people respond to that. And I think artists respond to that as well.
And could you kind of reflect? I know that you have this identity where you're both a curator and an architect, and so when you enter spaces like this and you see exhibitions like Mika's or Nate's, kind of how are you responding to them, like in relationship to how the work sits on the wall, but also literally what are on the walls?
Yeah, one thing I was thinking about when I was exploring the work is that for me, this space is a museum, but it's also a house, and those things are really always in tension for me. And so as an architect, I'm thinking about, you know, how does it work as an architect and a curator, thinking about how does it work to think about showing work or producing work in a space that was previously a bedroom, or is also a bathroom, or has plumbing, or has a lighting fixture or something that is so distinct. Recently, I was at an event where I asked people what their favorite building was, because I think all architects are nerds and have favorite buildings that they can like say off the cuff. But most people actually just said my own house, you know? They hadn't been thinking about architecture in the kind of weird, objectified way that I do, but actually their own house becomes a space that's highly curated, that's highly specific to how they want to live in it and be in it. And so I think people understand architecture through houses in a really specific way, that houses also have narratives, right? And that the building itself has all these histories. I think one of the tensions that I think is really incredible in the work that both of you did is like a house that's preserved has kind of one narrative, or sometimes it feels like it has one narrative that's presented. But in both your works, there seems like there's space to call out narratives that aren't part of the kind of primary history. And they started to make me think like, this wood that's on the wall, like the wainscoting, where's that wood coming from? Who crafted it? Who built it, right? Because that's like very legible in your work and in Nate's work and in Mika's work. I think about like the kind of individual artifacts and their provenance, right? So I think there's, for me, always a tension between thinking about how things are built and what stories they tell, but also what stories we might miss when we think we know the story of a building.
I think earlier on we were having a conversation where we were talking specifically about Nate's work and kind of what are some of those stories that are kind of embedded. There's a kind of haunting going on. I wanted Nate to kind of like speak to some of those ideas, like why the particular narrative of your great-grandfather in these spaces in this particular way.
Sorry, what was the last word that you said?
Why the narrative of your great-grandfather in this particular space, but also in the way that you've kind of, you know, embedded these bone holograms in the objects.
Yeah. I mean, I started thinking about the potential that between my great-grandfather's departure from what I now know is North Carolina, but when I first heard the story, it was unclear where he had started from. So between his departure from the South and his arrival in the North, which is like really early on in the Great Migration, I started thinking about that space of travel as a liminal space wherein his identity was kind of like floating, and that there was a potential that break in identity, because when he left, he abandoned his name, and when he arrived, he took on a new name, which was not uncommon at the time, you know. So this is not an uncommon story, but I was really interested in the potential that between the two places that there was a kind of void, an absence of identity. In a lot of my work, I have been thinking about the way that belief is formed through a kind of framework, whether it be aesthetic or whether it be auditory or whether it be, you know, ideological, that there might be a kind of empty space wherein ideologies rest. And then I was like, you know, I got to the point where I had these bones of a horse, and the bones are the bones of the horse that he rode from the South to the North, that then he buried because he was also hiding. He was also fugitive. But I started thinking about the bones as also like another kind of proof that if you could like take some bones and like roll them on the ground, that then you might be able to receive like the prophetic truth of like God or something like that. So in a way, they also became a kind of framework to produce a kind of belief. But I always wanted those things to be a little bit difficult to access. I always wanted the work to kind of run away, or like the closer you get to the work, the more difficult it is to see. So as you approach the bones, they actually disappear. Your presence actually makes them more difficult to see. And I was thinking about ways of which we think about it, even not only the history of those who came before us, but our own actual being as something that, as we approach it, as we go through life, it's not as if we become fully aware of who we are. We actually maybe become less aware, because by the time we figure out who we are, we've already changed. You know? So I was just thinking about like what that might look like, and I always felt like it had to look like something somewhat metaphysical, somewhat like ghostly. So in a lot of ways, I'm thinking about that aesthetic. I mean, of course, like you're in this museum, which was a house, but it also has to do with access to capital, to resource, and that the more access to wealth you have, the more ornate you can produce something to be, and that ornateness is sort of proof of the fact that one should have the kind of power that they have. So it sort of circles back around to it. So, and yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, I'm critical of some of those things, or I want to cast doubt on some of those things, and or at least encourage a deeper way of thinking about, you know, the aesthetics of power and how we take those for granted sometimes. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, I think that's you know, illuminating, and I think broadens the conversation in a way that I think becomes really productive. I think particularly your choice of the word power and how there's proof of it, right? The proof is in this house, the proof is in its ornateness. And in the same way as the bones are proof of something, you know, they're also indicative of an absence at the same time. And when I'm thinking of Mika's work, there's a conversation around power as well, because you're producing these paintings that mimic these didactic panels that are supposed to tell us something and have an authority about what a story is supposed to be. In your case, these particular objects from the Nickerson's collection. How are you critical, or how do you think about power as it operates, or as your work is in conversation with?
Say that last part again.
How are you thinking of power in relationship to your works? What kinds of questions are you asking, or what is your inquiry? What are you interrogating?
So, yeah, in one of, well, I'm gonna go back a little bit, but I wanted to approach the works for this exhibition, sort of examining two main characteristics of this space, which is one, a house, and then another, a museum. And imitate different aspects of those. So in the whole exhibition resides on the second floor galleries. There were previously bedrooms of the original residence, which of course is the most intimate and personal of type of space that could exist. And so in the front room, which was Samuel Nickerson's room, I wanted to stage a scene that appears as though it could have belonged there. And it's a preservation of something that never actually existed to be preserved in the first place. And that kind of appearance, like indicating a truth that is actually fiction is continued in a different way in the second room. Which was formerly their son Roland's room. I wanted to create a setting that appears as a palpable exhibition belonging in a museum. So if you walk from the entrance of the house on the first floor, walk through the gallery rooms, there are these signposts that are present in every room. We read them, we take them as authoritative truth or as factual, and that could eventually like just camouflage into the space, right? So in Roland's room, the works are mimicking the physical form of these museum didactic signposts that are present throughout each of the galleries, but there's painted images of a collection of artifacts, all sort of having to do with related to containers, which are now like emptied shells within a museum. So they appear as standard museum signs. However, there are demarcated text columns that are emptied. The text that is supposed to accompany the image, inform the image is omitted. Instead, there's a void there. So I think in omitting the text and instead presenting a void, I wanted to try to, I wanted to try to create a space for a new author to fill in or to create a new sort of historical piece of fiction. I'm not sure if that's...
So in some way you're using the museum as an apparatus to do the things that you are critical of in some ways?
Yeah, well, right, like the signs, and we read signs, they're kind of omnipresent, and they can sort of, without being aware of your own observations, slip into your experience and like cement a belief or maybe encourage a type of thinking. And so, yeah, the idea of or the idea of like this museological approach is kind of underlines everything that I into the exhibition. Yeah.
Okay. On that note, speaking of kind of like this, thinking about how we're cementing beliefs and cementing ideas, Ross, you're curatorial manager at the James Addams Hall House. You're kind of engaged in thinking and writing around exhibitions. When you're thinking about how to lead an audience through something, what is that process like to you? Being aware of, as Mika is saying, that intentionally and unintentionally you can cement certain ideas. What does that process look like for you, and how are you critical of those processes?
I mean, I guess people come to our museum because it is a historic museum with lots of preconceived notions. We're a house museum, so I always tell people, when you think of a house museum, think of a churning butter museum, right? That you went to as a kid and you were churning butter. I know I did that at house museums. And you're kind of meant to really be transported back in time, right? And you're meant to kind of somehow feel and be in touch directly with what people were doing at a certain date. And so I think that's what people arrive at Hull House with. And then people also know a lot about Hull House. Jane Addams herself was a hugely important figure. And so a lot of the work we do at the museum is reveal what those real stories are. It might be in conflict or a little bit different than what people expect. So we're really intentional about that. And then also, because we're actually not a churning butter we're a museum that does try to connect the past with the present in a way that doesn't feel superficial, but feels kind of engaged and embodied, and that's super challenging to do. And I think one of the key things about Nate's work in this space and Mika's work in this space, I think this speaks to exactly what you were talking about, this idea that museums hold a lot of authority. They're very trusted. And so it's really important that we have artists to come in to create new narratives, open up new spaces, and undermine some of that authority, right? And challenge some of that authority so that when guests arrive, they realize there's space for them to kind of to understand things differently, to ask questions. I think the mystical nature that Nate's work brings into this space is remarkably important, given I think how, when people see the things that are ornate or very I don't know if the right word is luxurious. They really do have a lot of expectations of what that might mean, right? That might mean this space isn't for me. That might mean this is just rich people's space. That might mean nobody I know can make anything like this, right? That could mean a lot of different things. And so artists, I think our education team, artists we invite into Hull House, and I think this is true in this instance here, working with folks who can undermine that a little bit and bring new narratives in is significant, right? It's uber significant because that forwards the mission that we have at our museum, but it helps us invite different kinds of people in, right? And, and I think this question about craft actually is really significant, I think. This is it's evident in Mika's work and in, of course, in Nate's work, and in the space itself, right? There's lots of craft happening. But oftentimes craft is the craft making, the wood, the plush floors, the nice wallpaper is often really distant from the people who are making it and that kind of labor, right? And it's incredibly powerful, I think, to have artists come in that bring in craft, and we know who they are, right? And we know their stories, and they're bringing a level of sophistication that isn't just about presenting something as it is, but presenting something kind of with all its layered meanings, right? So people can understand those and see those things. And I feel like that's really significant and kind of a strategy that I think we use to deconstruct the institutions that are, around us, right? I think that's important.
I saw you furiously writing away, and I wondered if you have any questions, for the artists or, yeah.
I don't know. I loved your comment. I was thinking that, that by knowing a little bit about Nate's family through the work, one's kind of reminded that, like, the mill worker from the late 19th century who made this cabinet also has a great grandfather, right, and a great grandmother and a whole family, and that kind of maybe like one thing that museum signage or didactics can do is not just like tell a story, but like share a way of asking questions or share a way of experiences in a space or thinking about work. And that, like a curatorial work isn't necessarily just like to say like this is how you should look at it, but maybe to say like how can we look at this in a different way. I really appreciated Mika asking like how do we present things, how do we present like histories or stories that never existed as material objects is something I've been thinking about. When I was visiting the work yesterday, looking at the black on black paintings that Nate did, one of the Treehouse team members who was like awesome, he came up to me and because I was like kind of standing in front of it, and he said, "Oh, you can read it if you like get to the side of it like this," and he kind of like showed me. But in that moment, I was kind of experiencing something that, I don't know, this emotion of not being able to read and not knowing and getting a sense that maybe there was also a mystery in your family's story that you were trying to figure out. Like for my family, and I think for many others, they're just like histories we don't talk about. Like I recently like tried to ask my dad about my grandfather working in Chinese restaurants in New York, and like I don't know anything about it, right? And there's certainly no house where there's some artifact from that era, and there's no historian who has written down like the paper sons of my like immigrant grandparents. Like, there's no story there, right? Or there is a story there, but like part of the work is to get at it, and so like I appreciate both in the gray didactics of the museum signage and Mika's work and the black on black paintings that like one of the things you guys do is like hold space for not knowing that it's okay if you can't read it, like that's actually a feeling that many of us have. Like sometimes you just try to get at something and you can't read it, and that's like a thing that we live with. So I don't know, I appreciate that too, especially in a space where like butter churning wants to explain it all. Like, from the butter churn, like then you get eat it at the gift shop. Like, it wants to like tell the whole thing, but actually lived experiences, spaces like that, most of the times you just like don't know, and like your dad won't tell you or can't tell you. Right?
I think that's super important. I mean, because I think the things that we even think that we can read, we really can't. Not in its fullness. You know what I mean? We presume that it's clear to us because like they told us about how they started churning butter, and then they took us through the whole history of butter churning, and then we got to churn some butter ourselves. We don't really know shit about butter churning, but now we think we do. So sometimes I think it's important to encounter things that let us know that we don't know all that we think we know. You know what I mean? So I really appreciate you bringing that up, because I think that's super important. And I wanted to say something in relation to what you were talking about, Ross, about the laborer. One of the things that I appreciate about being an artist is that I get to be the laborer, but oftentimes the laborer isn't allowed the agency. You're just like hired labor to produce the thing for the other person who, because of their societal or economic status, has the agency. But as an artist, I can be the laborer and maintain or retain some ideological agency. You know what I mean? So I was struck by thinking about that as well.
That's a particularly important point, this level of agency. I think there's a project that I just can't help but mention that Jane Addams started in I can't remember the exact date, I'm going to say 1909, but no one checked. Called the Labor Museum. And this was an effort for her to kind of lift up the work of the immigrant women who were bringing like knowledge of textile work to the immigrant community on the west side of Chicago. In relationship to the textile factories where they all worked. These are women who like know how to make textiles, going to factories, working 12-hour days, doing another set of textile labor work that is really disconnected from their own heritage that they're bringing, right? Jane Addams saw this as she moved around the west side of Chicago and decided that she wanted to lift up that labor, and this is mostly immigrant women, right? Lift up that textile labor with this museum as kind of essentially an indictment of the larger textile, factory work. That there's like another set of knowledge here, another set of ideas here, not just the objects themselves, but the knowledge that people are bringing. And we're not lifting that up, we're not understanding that, we're not interrogating that, we're not in dialogue with that, and her labor museum was the effort to do all those things. And that is so true with just this like craft, because of most of the craft we see, even in the city of Chicago and the architecture, like we know who designed it, we're not necessarily deeply in touch with where did the limestone come from, like who was smelting this, who like twisted all the iron work that's along all the different tracks here. It's not just like who did it, but the knowledge that was provided that did it. I think that's what you're getting at, Nate. And I think that's super true with the work you're doing too, because that knowledge is real and it gets lost or broken down, and we can't trace those narratives and histories. And that's why I like the Trump Lloyd to bring that. That's a whole like an old craft facility that artists had when they got sick of trying to like make things look like they were. They wanted to fool you in the space that you were in, right? They wanted to say, my power is like out, not only just the frame, but it's outside the frame, it reaches out into the space you were actually in. And I can change like the inside of your brain to make your eyes work a different way. So that kind of power of that it's still like, using that power I think is really significant, right? And so I like that it comes through in a different kind of way in this particular space, in the way that you're working. I think that's a great move.
Well, I wonder also, in like Mika's work is pointing to, like to be a little meta, that there's both the kind of craftsmanship of the architecture around us, right? Like the tufting and the carving and the gilding, but there's also like the work of cultural workers here in this space. So by bringing the kind of signage forward for us and say like, this is a thing that somebody, like, and when I imagine like you painting kind of meticulously these incredible realistic images, but I also think like, there are folks who are working on this language and it's about kind of honoring that work, but also just rendering it visible, that there's authorship in that too. Like, I mean, I think it's worth noting that we are in this kind of like immaculate space, but there's like a whole team here, right, who I see, who folks will never see, whose work is also contributing to making this kind of conversation possible. And I mean, I think that's what I love about the kind of like layered approach of both of your work together, is that we're looking at labor and craft both like at the house level and then the museum level, right? And not to like overly fetishize or overvalue, or I don't know, but just to kind of like shine a light on for a minute and ask everyone to kind of slow down and think a little bit more about those processes. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I think craft is super important to both Nate's work and my work. I think we're definitely both students of craft and probably forever will be. You're probably the bigger craft nerd. But we're both happen to be working with very traditional materials that, like, at its core hasn't, the material itself hasn't changed much over time. And yeah, I think that's a really nice thread throughout the two separate exhibitions.
Yeah, I think we got a question from one of our audiences, and I want to pass it on to Stephanie to read out one of the questions, if you could.
I'm going to read out some things that people are posting from home. So the first question is, can you talk about what reflections you had before and after your work was installed in the space? Did the work that you propose or ask questions result in ways that you hadn't predicted or anticipated? So essentially, any surprises that you have now that you see the work installed versus how you conceived it?
I don't know.
Well, it's always there's always an anticipation of reveal, seeing your work installed in this space that's meant to be installed in. But in this situation, I think that was super amplified because of the space that we're in. This like amazingly this amazing example of a Gilded Age preserved mansion, and yeah, I guess I don't know, surprises. That it worked.
What are your thoughts, Nate? What was your...
Not really. I mean, other than all the surprises for me really happened in the studio, maybe, but for the most part, the way that before I started constructing the work and from to the end, I mean, it's I was pretty set. I mean, not necessarily. I mean, I had ideas about doing this or ideas about doing that, but once I took a direction and started going with that, for the most part, I stuck to that course. I mean, the one difficulty was that I was trying to use the same type of wood that was in the rooms that I was working in. That wood in that room is like 100 years old, at least, if not a little bit more, right? And wood changes over time. So the difficulty was trying to get the wood that I was working with to hurry up and get 100 years old. So maybe one day.
But then the other wood will be 200 years old.
Yeah, right.
Did you have another follow-up question, Stephanie, from one of our audiences?
Yeah, this one's directed towards Nate, which is, why holograms?
Well, okay, so yeah, the bones have been something that I didn't want to allow people to see directly ever since I first started working with them. So they were like, I was making drawings, and I felt like making a drawing of something was a way to give people access to see something without them actually being able to access it directly. So the hologram was another way to kind of maybe two things. One, first of all, give access without giving full access visually, and at the same time also make a thing look like it was there and not there at the same time, or that there was some kind of mystery, or that something was happening that you couldn't quite figure out what was happening or why it was happening. It's a little bit mysterious or spiritual in that sense when you can't figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
We have one more for Mika also, which is, there are often personal elements to your other works. Are there any personal elements in these works, or are those personal fictions?
Say the last part again.
Are there any personal elements to these works, or are they personal fictions?
The latter. Well, not entirely, but but
Expand.
I was thinking about I don't remember if I said this previously, but I was thinking about the exhibition being a temporary guest within the house, and then also a visitor within the museum. And I was kind of toying with the idea that maybe that's an anonymous guest and anonymous visitor. I try to kind of walk back from like my hand and myself being at the forefront. Like in experiencing and seeing the work. I think that's built into the work, and that could come later. But yeah, so both, I guess.
Well, I just have one question now based on those, which is, you called it an anonymous guest, and Nate, you said something about disappearance. I mean, do these works feel like ghosts to you, or phantoms, like part of the house's history?
Maybe for me, I mean, yeah, I was hoping that they would be like sort of phantom guests in the house. I mean, at one point I thought about, you know, what kind of phantoms are present here based on the history of the house. And then I just realized maybe it was okay if I just brought my own phantoms. You know, like I got phantoms. I don't have to find no new phantoms. I got my own phantoms. I'll just bring them, and they can hang out for a while. But yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Thank you.
I know for you, Mika, you found these kind of like stories of the Nickerson collection through these Netsuke objects. Could you talk maybe more about why you were interested in in that particular collecting history or story, and you know why it resonated with you to give these particular objects a kind of presence, you know?
Yeah. Well, in researching the residence, like the first residence of this house, the Nickersons, that was a surprise to come across. So they were, you know, obviously like art collectors, and had amassed a really large collection of works that then in 1900 they gifted to the Art Institute of Chicago. And that donation, that gift, consisted of a whole range of European paintings, etchings, watercolors, but most notably artifacts from Japan and from China that were a really significant addition to the Art Institute at the time, and still. Some of those can be seen, or some of those are currently exhibited. A lot of those are in storage. But Kekeli and I had an opportunity to be able to go to the Art Institute and see some of these objects in person that had been stored away. It's a random collection. You know, like I couldn't quite, you know, pinpoint their approach in collecting these works, other than that maybe these works are bedazzling, and you know, again, the craft of it is like kind of fantastic. But the works that I selected from that collection to then depict as these museum didactic signposts are, it's also, like, I was also trying to follow that history of, it's a random assortment. But they are, a lot of them have to do with like a physical container, or parts of a physical container. Like, for instance, the Anetsuke's functional object, it's a toggle that is connected to like a wooden box that served as a pouch, because kimonos don't have pockets. And that sort of originated in the 17th century Japan, and over time the craftspeople just they took it. They had so much fun with it. So it eventually developed into personal expressions of the craft maker, of the maker, like unique one-offs that then the aesthetic of it eventually overrode the actual just practical function. They're tiny sculptures, but yeah, I don't actually remember what the original question was.
I think, just kind of wrapping it up, I think in thinking about your work, and you were talking about, you know, it started out as a very functional object, and then the craftspeople took it over. In some way, it's like a weird metaphor for how the house, you know, has developed. You know, it's firstly built, and you know, it was burnt down, and then the rebuilding, the craftspeople just took it over, and we see like their attention to detail and how much fun they had within this building and within this space. And you know, in some ways, that's some of the legacy that we have to work with and kind of to live with in the museum. And so I just wanted to thank you as artists for bringing your personal eye and the narratives that you're thinking about, and kind of the critique that you carry as well to this space, and to bring and pull out some of those kind of historical conversations into the contemporary space, and travel back in time and take some of those contemporary, you know, ideas back into these kind of historical spaces. And I wanted to also thank our panelists for joining us and for, you know, kind of adding to what this discourse has been from both of your respective fields and disciplines. I think that it has given us an opportunity to think about not only just this exhibition, but also exhibitions within historic house museums from, you know, an interesting and kind of like oblique angle that oftentimes we don't have the opportunity to consider when we're walking into these spaces and kind of being taken by awe, by kind of awe that's all on the walls and the floors. And so I wanted to thank you both for joining us, and I wanted to thank our virtual audience for joining us on the stream as well. These interesting times have afforded us an opportunity to engage with you all in a very different way, and so I wanted to thank you for being here and for asking such thoughtful questions of the artists and of the panelists. And I wanted to remind you that the exhibition is still open. If you want to see the works that were in conversation from Nate and from Mika, definitely come through. We're open 3 days a week. On the weekends, reserve a ticket, come look at the exhibition and be awed by the Treehouse Museum. So thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you when you come around.